I'm David Miller, 68 years old. My millionaire daughter, Emily Miller, left me $35 million and her vintage 1967 Mustang. 10 years after he dumped her, her ex showed up at her funeral demanding it all. He messed with the wrong dad. Please like the video, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. You want to know what real rage feels like? It's sitting in that funeral home, watching the woman who raised herself into a millionaire being lowered into the ground, and having some piece of garbage waltz in like he owns the place. That's Daniel Peterson, and I'm going to tell you exactly what kind of monster he is and how I made him pay for every single thing he did to my Emily. My daughter Emily was everything good in this world, and I'm not saying that because I'm her father. I'm saying it because it's the goddamn truth. When her mother Margaret died of cancer when Emily was just 12 years old, I thought my world was over. Margaret was the light in our house, the one who made Emily laugh, who braided her hair, who knew exactly what to say when Emily had nightmares. When we lost her, I didn't know how the hell I was going to raise a 12-year-old girl by myself. But Emily. God, that girl was stronger than both her parents combined. She grieved for her mother, don't get me wrong. There were nights I'd find her crying in the garage, sitting in that 1967 Mustang that Margaret loved so much, the one we kept covered with a tarp because I couldn't bear to look at it. But Emily picked herself up. She threw herself into school, into books, into dreams that were bigger than anything I could have imagined for a kid from our neighborhood. While other teenagers were worried about prom dates and weekend parties, Emily was reading business magazines and sketching designs for clothes. She'd tell me about this vision she had, retail stores that would make fashion accessible but still beautiful, places where working women could find clothes that made them feel powerful without breaking their bank accounts. I'll be honest, I didn't understand half of what she was talking about back then. I was a simple man who worked in accounting, and here was my daughter dreaming about building an empire. But Emily didn't just dream. She worked. She got scholarships to Northwestern, graduated summa cum laude with a business degree, and started building connections before she even had her diploma. By the time she was 25, she was already laying the groundwork for what would become M Avenue. That's when she met Daniel Peterson. I should have known. I should have seen right through that smooth-talking son of a bitch from the moment Emily brought him home. He was 32 to her 25, dressed in expensive suits he couldn't afford, talking about big deals and investment opportunities that never seemed to materialize. But Emily was young and successful and probably lonely, and Daniel knew exactly how to make her feel like she needed him. They got married in 2012, and I walked my daughter down the aisle with a smile on my face and a knot in my stomach. Something about Daniel just felt wrong. The way he looked at Emily's business plans like he was calculating their worth, the way he inserted himself into conversations with her investors, the way he started talking about our company when Emily had built everything herself. But Emily was happy, or at least she seemed happy, so I kept my mouth shut. That was my first mistake. The business kept growing. Emily opened her first flagship store in Chicago in 2013, and the crowds were insane. Women lined up around the block for her grand opening because Emily had somehow figured out the magic formula: high-quality clothes that looked expensive but were actually affordable, store layouts that made shopping feel like an experience instead of a chore, and customer service that made every woman feel like she was the most important person in the world. Daniel, meanwhile, was calling himself a business consultant and riding Emily's coattails. He'd show up to her meetings uninvited, hand out business cards with both their names on them, and somehow convince people that he was an equal partner in Emily's success. The rage I feel thinking about this is indescribable. This man was literally stealing credit for my daughter's genius, and she was too in love and too trusting to see it. Then 2014 happened, and that's when I learned what kind of monster Daniel Peterson really was. Emily came to me in February of that year, glowing with excitement and terror in equal measure. She was pregnant. 8 weeks along, she said, and she was scared but happy. She'd always wanted children, always talked about the family she'd build someday. She was already talking about converting one of the spare rooms in their condo into a nursery, about how she'd teach the baby about business and about Grandma Margaret. I was over the moon. The thought of being a grandfather, of watching Emily become the mother I knew she'd be, of having a piece of Margaret back in our lives through this new little person, it felt like the universe was finally giving us something good again. But when Emily told Daniel, everything changed. She came to my house 3 days later looking like she'd been hit by a truck. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying, and she could barely get the words out. Daniel had told her he wasn't ready to be a father. Wasn't ready for the financial burden of a child. Wasn't ready for Emily to be distracted from the business by pregnancy and motherhood. The business. Her business. The business she'd built with her own hands and her own vision while he sat around calling himself a consultant. But it got worse. So much worse. Daniel didn't just tell Emily he wasn't ready for a baby. He told her she had to choose, him or the pregnancy. He actually looked my daughter in the eye and told her that if she went through with having this baby, he was done. Done with the marriage, done with supporting her business, done with everything. I wanted to drive to their condo and beat the living hell out of him. I wanted to grab him by his expensive tie and throw him off their balcony. But Emily begged me not to make things worse. She still thought she could reason with him, still thought the man she'd married was somewhere inside this monster. She chose the baby. Of course she chose the baby. Emily had more love in her little finger than Daniel had in his entire body. But the story doesn't end there, because Daniel Peterson wasn't content to just abandon his pregnant wife. No, that wouldn't have been devastating enough for a man like him. 3 weeks after Emily told him she was keeping the baby, I got a phone call that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. Emily was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. Daniel had cleaned out their joint bank account, all $12,000 they'd saved up for business expenses and the baby. Every penny, gone. But that wasn't even the worst part. He'd also racked up debts in both their names. Credit cards, personal loans, something called a business line of credit that Emily had never seen or signed for. Over $30,000 in debt that Emily suddenly found herself responsible for. And then he disappeared. Just vanished like he'd never existed, leaving my pregnant daughter with an empty bank account, a mountain of debt, and a business she was trying to build while dealing with morning sickness and heartbreak. Emily lost the baby in her second trimester. The stress, the doctor said. The combination of financial pressure and emotional trauma was too much for her body to handle. I held my daughter while she cried for the grandchild I'd never meet, for the family she'd wanted so desperately, for the husband who'd abandoned her when she needed him most. That's when the real fury set in. Not just anger, fury. The kind of rage that burns in your chest and keeps you awake at night and makes you want to hunt down the person who hurt your child and make them pay for every single tear they caused. But Emily was stronger than her grief. She took that pain and she forged it into steel. She threw herself into building M Avenue with a determination that was almost frightening to watch. She worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week. She negotiated with suppliers while learning how to rebuild her credit. She designed new clothing lines while fighting off debt collectors. She opened her second flagship store in New York while testifying in divorce proceedings. The divorce was finalized in late 2014, and Emily's attorney Michael Clark made sure that Daniel Peterson signed away every single claim to Emily's business, her assets, her future earnings, everything. It was all notarized, all legal, all ironclad. Daniel walked away with nothing, and Emily was finally free. Free to build the empire she'd always dreamed of. Free to become the woman her mother would have been proud of. Free to show the world that you don't need a man to succeed, you just need vision, determination, and the refusal to let anyone else's weakness hold you back. And that's exactly what she did. Over the next 10 years, Emily built M Avenue into a $50 million company. 2 flagship stores became 5, then 10, then 20. She launched an online platform that revolutionized how women shopped for professional clothing. She created a line of affordable accessories that became status symbols in their own right. She employed over 200 people, mostly women, and made sure every single one of them had health insurance, paid sick leave, and opportunities for advancement. Emily became everything Daniel had tried to stop her from becoming. She became wealthy, successful, independent, and powerful. She never remarried, never had children, but she built something better than a traditional family. She built a legacy that would last long after she was gone. The 1967 Mustang became her pride and joy. She had it fully restored, painted the same deep blue it had been when her mother was alive. She'd take it out on weekends, driving through the countryside with the windows down and music playing, and for a few hours she could pretend her mother was sitting in the passenger seat, proud of the woman Emily had become. In January 2025, Emily updated her will with Michael Clark. She was 38 years old, healthy as far as anyone knew, and planning for a future that stretched decades ahead. She named me as her sole heir, $35 million in assets and that beautiful Mustang. She said she wanted to make sure that if anything ever happened to her, her legacy would be protected by someone who had loved her since before she drew her first breath. 6 weeks later, Emily collapsed in her office during a board meeting. Pancreatic cancer, the doctor said. Stage 4, aggressive, inoperable. The same disease that had taken her mother, coming from my daughter with the same merciless efficiency. Emily fought like hell for 3 months. She kept working from her hospital bed, kept making decisions about the company, kept planning for a future she must have known she wouldn't see. Patricia Johnson, her COO and former personal assistant, brought files to the hospital every day. Emily signed contracts and approved marketing campaigns between chemotherapy sessions. But the cancer was stronger than even Emily's will to live. On March 22, 2025, I lost the last piece of my family. I lost my daughter, my best friend, the person who had given my life meaning for 38 years. The funeral was supposed to be a celebration of Emily's life. She'd planned it herself, down to the last detail. She wanted the service at St. Francis Grand Church in Chicago, where she'd been baptized and confirmed. She wanted the music to be uplifting, the flowers to be bright and colorful, the atmosphere to be hopeful rather than mournful. What she didn't plan for was Daniel Peterson showing up like a ghost from the worst period of her life. I saw him before the service started, sitting in the back row like he belonged there. 10 years older, a little grayer, wearing a black suit that looked expensive but not quite expensive enough to hide the desperation in his eyes. He was putting on a show of grief that made me sick to watch, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief, sighing dramatically, shaking his head like he'd lost the love of his life. During the service, he moved closer. Row by row, getting nearer to the front where I was sitting with Emily's closest friends and business associates. By the time we were ready to leave for the cemetery, Daniel Peterson was sitting directly behind me. That's when he leaned forward and whispered the words that started this war. "David, we need to talk about my rightful share, and the Mustang keys." Rightful share. This man who had abandoned my daughter when she was pregnant, who had stolen her money and left her with debt, who had disappeared for 10 years without so much as a phone call, was talking about his rightful share of her estate. I turned around and looked at him, and I'm sure he could see the murder in my eyes. But Daniel Peterson was either too stupid or too desperate to care about the rage radiating off me in waves. "I know what you're thinking," he said, still whispering but loud enough that I could hear every word clearly. "But Emily and I were married. There are spousal rights, paperwork loopholes. That business was built during our marriage. I have claims." Claims. This worthless piece of human garbage was talking about claims on Emily's life's work. "I have a lawyer," he continued. "We've already started looking into the situation. But I'd rather handle this quietly, between family. Maybe we can work something out without involving the courts." Family. He called us family. The man who had broken my daughter's heart and stolen her money and left her to build her empire alone was calling us family. I didn't say a word to him at the funeral. I didn't trust myself to speak without committing a felony. But as I watched them lower Emily's casket into the ground, as I listened to Patricia Johnson give a beautiful eulogy about Emily's vision and generosity, as I saw dozens of employees and customers crying for the woman who had changed their lives, I made a promise. Daniel Peterson was going to pay for every single thing he'd done to Emily. He was going to learn what happened when you messed with David Miller's daughter. He'd picked the wrong family to terrorize, and I was going to make sure he regretted every second of the hell I was about to put him through. The day after the funeral, I called Michael Clark. Michael had been Emily's attorney for over 10 years, and he'd been the one to draft her will just a few months before she died. He was 55 years old, sharp as a razor, and he'd known Emily well enough to love her like a daughter of his own. When I told him about Daniel's appearance at the funeral and his threats about legal claims, Michael's voice took on the same edge I'd heard in my own. "That bastard," he said, and I was glad to hear someone else's anger matching my own. Emily specifically came to me in January to make sure her will was bulletproof. She was worried about Daniel trying something exactly like this. Emily had been worried about Daniel. Even after 10 years, even after building a life and a business that had nothing to do with him, she'd still been looking over her shoulder for the man who had hurt her so badly. What can he actually do? I asked Michael, because I needed to know exactly what kind of fight we were facing. Michael was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him shuffling through papers. Legally? Almost nothing. The divorce decree from 2014 is very clear. Daniel waived all rights to Emily's business and any future assets. Emily made sure of that. But David, the legal system isn't perfect. If he has money for a good lawyer and a willingness to lie, he can tie up the estate in court for months or even years. Months or years. The thought of Daniel Peterson dragging Emily's name through the mud for months or years made me want to put my fist through the wall. "There's something else," Michael continued. "Emily gave me some documents to hold in her safe. Letters, records, things she said I might need if Daniel ever came back around. She never told me exactly what was in there, but she said it was insurance. Emily had been preparing for this fight even when she was dying. My brilliant, beautiful daughter had known that Daniel would crawl out of whatever hole he'd been hiding in the moment he smelled money, and she'd been ready for him. I want to see everything," I told Michael. "Every document, every record, every piece of evidence Emily left behind. I want to know exactly what kind of ammunition we have." But we needed more than just documents. We needed allies, people who knew Emily and knew her story, people who could testify to the truth about Daniel Peterson and what he'd done. That's where Patricia Johnson came in. Patricia was 34 years old and had worked for Emily for 8 years, first as her personal assistant and then as the COO of M Avenue. She was meticulous, loyal, and smart as hell. Emily had trusted her with everything: financial records, personal correspondence, business strategies, employee information. If anyone knew where the bodies were buried, it was Patricia. I met with Patricia and Michael the day after my conversation with Michael, in Emily's office at the flagship Chicago store. Being in that space, surrounded by Emily's vision and her success, made the rage burn even hotter. This was what Daniel Peterson wanted to take. This was what he thought he had a right to claim. He called the office yesterday, Patricia told us, her voice tight with controlled anger. 3 times. He wanted access to Emily's financial records, her business files, her personal correspondence. He said he was her widower and had a right to review everything. Widower. The man who had been married to Emily for less than 2 years, who had abandoned her a decade ago, was calling himself her widower. I told him to go to hell, Patricia continued, and I was proud of her for that. But David, he's not going to give up. He sounded desperate. Like a man who's got nothing left to lose. That's when my old colleague Andrew Moore came into the picture. Andrew was 60 years old and had worked in finance for most of his career. He had connections throughout the Chicago business community, and he'd always been good at finding information about people when you needed to know what you were dealing with. I called Andrew and asked him to do some digging on Daniel Peterson. What I learned made me understand why Daniel had shown up at Emily's funeral like a vulture circling a corpse. Daniel's consulting business had failed spectacularly in 2022. He'd gotten involved in some kind of cryptocurrency speculation that had gone bad, lost most of his clients' money, and ended up being forced to shut down. But that wasn't the worst of it. Andrew's sources said Daniel had been gambling heavily for years, sports betting, poker games, online casinos. He owed serious money to serious people, somewhere around $80,000 in gambling debts. Daniel Peterson wasn't just greedy. He was desperate. And desperate men do desperate things. That's when the lawsuit hit. 48 pages of legal garbage filed by Christopher Vaughn, a 50-year-old inheritance litigator with a reputation for taking cases other lawyers wouldn't touch. The complaint was full of lies and half-truths and legal theories that would have made a first-year law student laugh. Daniel was claiming that Emily's business had been built during their marriage, that he had contributed to its development through consulting and strategic advice, that he had introduced Emily to key investors and suppliers, that his intellectual property had been foundational to EM Avenue's success. Every single word was a lie. Emily had started developing her business plan in college, years before she met Daniel. Her first investor was a professor who had been impressed by her senior thesis. Her initial suppliers were contacts she'd made through internships and networking events. Daniel Peterson had contributed exactly nothing to Emily's success except the motivation to prove she could build something beautiful without him. But lies don't have to be true to cause damage, especially when they're wrapped in legal language and filed in court with official seals and signatures. The Chicago Chronicle picked up the story, and their coverage made me want to burn down their building. "Is Dad blocking grieving husband?" was the headline, accompanied by a photo of Daniel at Emily's funeral looking like the picture of grief. The article painted me as a controlling father trying to keep Emily's widower from his rightful inheritance. Social media amplified the lies. People who had never met Emily or Daniel or me were commenting on articles and sharing posts about the heartbroken husband being denied his wife's fortune by her bitter father. The narrative was spreading like poison, and I felt powerless to stop it. That's when Michael Clark reminded me that the truth is always stronger than lies, especially when you have documentation. Emily's safe contained exactly what Michael had promised: insurance. Documents and records that told the real story of Daniel Peterson and what he'd done to my daughter. The first piece of evidence was a notarized addendum to their 2014 divorce decree. In August of that year, after the divorce was final, Daniel had signed an additional document explicitly waiving any future rights to Emily's assets, income, or business interests. It was witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. Emily had insisted on it, and Daniel had signed it without hesitation because at the time, Emily's business was worth almost nothing and he was eager to cut all ties. That document alone should have been enough to end Daniel's lawsuit before it started. But there was more. Emily had kept emails. Dozens of them, sent by Daniel during February and March of 2014, when their marriage was falling apart. In those emails, Daniel admitted to draining their joint bank account. He called Emily's retail business a childish fantasy. He said she was wasting time and money on a venture that will never succeed. He told her she should focus on being a wife instead of playing businesswoman. The woman who built a $50 million company was playing businesswoman, according to the man who now wanted to claim credit for her success. But the most damning evidence was something I never could have expected. Patricia Johnson had been recording phone calls. Since December 2024, when Emily first got sick, Patricia had been archiving all office phone recordings as part of standard business practice. Those recordings captured something extraordinary: phone calls from Daniel Peterson to the M Avenue offices. In late December 2024, just a few weeks after Emily's diagnosis became public, Daniel had called the office asking about Emily's condition. Not because he cared about her health, but because he wanted to know if reconciliation might be worth pursuing, now that Emily was obviously successful. Worth pursuing. He was calculating whether Emily's illness made her vulnerable enough to manipulate. The recordings got worse. In February and March 2025, as Emily's condition deteriorated, Daniel had called multiple times asking for meetings with Emily. Patricia had attended those meetings as Emily's representative, and every conversation had been recorded. On February 28, 2025, Daniel had proposed a settlement. He would drop any future legal claims against Emily's estate in exchange for $5 million. When Patricia told him that was never going to happen, Daniel had gotten angry. "Look," he'd said, and his voice on the recording was cold and calculating, "Emily's dying. We both know that. When she's gone, there are going to be legal questions about that business. Questions about who really built it, who contributed what, who deserves what. I'm trying to be reasonable here, but if you force me to go through the courts, I can make this very expensive and very public for everyone involved." Extortion. He was extorting a dying woman. On March 14, 2025, just 8 days before Emily died, Daniel had called again. This time, he'd raised his demand to $15 million and had gotten more explicit about his threats. "I know things about that business that Emily wouldn't want to become public," he'd said. "I know about suppliers who cut corners, about tax strategies that might not hold up under scrutiny, about employee situations that could become problematic. Pay me what I'm asking, or I guarantee you that Emily's last months are going to be spent dealing with audits and investigations and media attention." He was threatening to destroy Emily's reputation while she was dying of cancer. But Daniel Peterson hadn't stopped with phone calls and threats. He tried to bribe bank employees. Nina Patel was a 29-year-old teller at North Shore Federal, the bank where Emily kept her business accounts. In January 2025, Daniel had approached Nina and offered her $5,000 to provide him with information about Emily's account balances and recent transactions. Nina had refused and filed an incident report with bank security. Bank compliance officers had contacted Emily's attorney about the attempted bribery, and Michael Clark had added those reports to Emily's legal file. Daniel Peterson had committed a felony trying to get information about Emily's finances. We had him. We had everything we needed to destroy Daniel Peterson's fraudulent lawsuit and send him to prison for extortion and attempted bribery. But Michael Clark and I agreed that we wanted to do more than just win. We wanted to expose Daniel for what he really was, and we wanted to make sure he could never hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt Emily. Michael filed a motion to dismiss Daniel's lawsuit with prejudice, attaching Emily's will, the notarized waiver, the recorded phone conversations, and the divorce decree. He also filed a motion compelling Daniel to produce any contracts, invoices, emails, or other documents proving his alleged contributions to Emily's business. But our real strategy was to build a witness list that would tell the complete story of who Emily Miller was and who Daniel Peterson was. Helen Davis was Emily's college best friend, now 38 years old and working as a marketing executive in Detroit. Helen had been at Northwestern with Emily when they met Daniel, and she'd watched their relationship implode in real time. Helen could testify about Daniel's abandonment, about his ridicule of Emily's business ambitions, about the way he tried to make Emily feel small and dependent. Patricia Johnson would provide the timeline that proved Daniel was lying about his business contributions. M Avenue had been incorporated in January 2016, nearly 2 years after Daniel disappeared from Emily's life. Every supplier relationship, every investor meeting, every strategic decision had been made after Daniel was long gone. Nina Patel, the bank teller, would testify about Daniel's attempted bribery and his desperate efforts to get information about Emily's finances. But we also knew that Daniel's attorney, Christopher Vaughn, would have his own witnesses. Men like Vaughn don't file 48-page lawsuits without some kind of evidence, even if that evidence is fabricated. The first court hearing was scheduled for June 15, 2025, in front of Judge Maria Delgado. Judge Delgado was 58 years old, had a reputation for being strict but fair, and didn't have patience for lawyers who wasted her time with frivolous claims. Daniel and Christopher Vaughn brought 3 witnesses to support their case, and I knew from the moment I saw them that we were dealing with professional liars. The first witness was Raymond "Ray" Simmons, a 47-year-old self-styled business consultant who claimed to have worked with Daniel on Emily's original business plan in 2013. According to Simmons, Daniel had been the strategic visionary behind EM Avenue's concept, and Emily had been just the implementation specialist. The second witness was Sarah Jones, a 33-year-old woman who claimed to have been Daniel's business partner during his marriage to Emily. Jones testified that she'd attended numerous strategy sessions with Daniel and Emily in 2013 and 2014, and that Daniel had been the one to develop the customer service protocols that became EM Avenue's signature. The third witness was Albert Reed, a 45-year-old man who claimed to have been an early investor in EM Avenue. Reed testified that Daniel had personally introduced him to Emily and had been instrumental in securing the initial funding for the business. All three witnesses were convincing on the surface. They had dates, details, and specific anecdotes about their interactions with Daniel and Emily. If you didn't know the truth, you might have believed them. But Michael Clark knew exactly how to expose liars, and he had the evidence to do it. When it was our turn to present evidence, Michael played the audio recordings from February 28 and March 14. The courtroom was dead silent as Daniel's voice filled the room, calculating and cold, talking about loopholes if she dies, and threatening years of legal hell unless he was paid. Michael then presented the notarized 2014 waiver and Emily's January 2025 will. Both documents were clear, unambiguous, and legally binding. Daniel Peterson had no claim to Emily's estate, period. But the real devastation came during cross-examination. Michael had done his homework on Daniel's witnesses, and what he'd found was explosive. Raymond Simmons had been fined for perjury in 2019 during a real estate case in New York. He was a professional witness who testified in exchange for payment, and his testimony had been discredited in multiple previous cases. Sarah Jones wasn't a business consultant or former partner. She was an amateur actress who had been paid $3,000 to testify for Daniel. Michael had bank records showing the payment and social media posts where Jones advertised her availability for testimonial services. Albert Reed had never been licensed as an investment advisor and had been fired from his previous job at Lakeview Auto for sales fraud. He'd been paid $5,000 to testify about investments he'd never made in a business he'd never heard of before Daniel contacted him. But the most damning evidence came from my nephew Charles Miller. Charles was 31 years old and worked in IT for a company called Falcon Investigations. I'd asked him to do some background checking on Daniel's witnesses, and what he'd found proved that Daniel Peterson was not just a liar but a criminal. Bank transfer records showed that Daniel had paid $8,000 to Raymond Simmons, $6,000 to Sarah Jones, and $5,000 to Albert Reed, all within 10 days of the court hearing. Daniel had literally purchased false testimony to support his fraudulent claim. Judge Maria Delgado had seen enough. She dismissed Daniel's lawsuit with prejudice, ordered him to pay all court costs, and imposed a $50,000 sanction for presenting false testimony. But more importantly, she referred the case to the Cook County District Attorney's Office for investigation of extortion, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. Daniel Peterson's lies had just become felonies. But our investigation was far from over. Once we started digging into Daniel's background, we discovered that Emily wasn't his first victim. This man had been running the same scam for over a decade, targeting vulnerable women and leaving a trail of destruction behind him. Luis Martinez was a 52-year-old private investigator who specialized in financial fraud cases. I hired Luis to map out Daniel's pattern of behavior, and what he found was sickening. Between 2014 and 2025, Daniel had targeted at least 12 women. His method was always the same: identify recently divorced or widowed women who had businesses or significant assets, build romantic relationships with them, gain access to their finances, and then disappear with whatever he could steal. Rose Fernandez was 45 years old and worked as a marketing director for a company called Crux Marketing. She'd dated Daniel from 2018 to 2020, and during that time he'd convinced her to let him help manage her finances. Daniel had siphoned off $35,000 from Rose's savings account before disappearing. When Rose tried to report the theft, Daniel had threatened to destroy her career by spreading lies about her professional conduct. Anthony Serrano was a 58-year-old retired small business owner who had lost his wife to Alzheimer's in 2019. Daniel had approached Anthony through a grief support group, offering investment advice and emotional support. Over the course of 6 months, Daniel had convinced Anthony to invest $80,000 in a shell company called Peterson Investments and Associates. When Anthony realized he'd been defrauded, Daniel had blackmailed him with secretly recorded videos and photos taken during their meetings. Luis Martinez identified 12 victims with total losses of approximately $400,000. Daniel Peterson was a predator who specialized in targeting people during the most vulnerable periods of their lives. But the most shocking discovery came when we started investigating Daniel's activities during Emily's final weeks in the hospital. Northwestern Memorial Hospital kept detailed visitor logs, and those records showed that Daniel had used forged spousal identification papers to gain access to Emily's room during late-night hours on March 5, March 12, and March 19, 2025. Mercedes Lopez was a 41-year-old oncology nurse who had been working on Emily's floor during those final weeks. Mercedes remembered Daniel's visits clearly because Emily had become agitated every time he left her room. She kept saying, "Don't let him make me sign anything," Mercedes told us during her interview. She was very specific about that. She said if anyone claiming to be her husband came around with papers, we should call her lawyer immediately. Hospital security footage confirmed Mercedes's testimony. The cameras showed Daniel entering Emily's room on March 19 carrying a folder, and leaving without it 30 minutes later. That folder had contained documents that would have made my blood run cold if I'd seen them while Emily was still alive. Patricia Johnson had worked with hospital security to recover that folder from Emily's room. Inside were 2 forged documents that showed the true depth of Daniel Peterson's criminality. The first was a counterfeit will modification that would have named Daniel as a 40% beneficiary of Emily's estate. The forgery was sophisticated but not perfect. The signature was close but not exact, and the notary seal was from a notary who hadn't been licensed in Illinois for over 3 years. The second document was even more sinister, a fraudulent durable power of attorney that would have given Daniel control over Emily's assets if she became incapacitated. If Emily had signed that document, Daniel could have drained her accounts, sold her business, and left her with nothing. Daniel Peterson hadn't just been extorting my dying daughter. He'd been planning to steal everything she built while she was too weak to stop him. The hospital logs, the forged documents, and Mercedes Lopez's testimony added new charges to Daniel's growing legal problems: forgery, coercion of a vulnerable adult, unlawful access to a medical facility, and identity misrepresentation. The criminal trial began in September 2025, with Assistant State's Attorney Robert Navarro prosecuting the case. Navarro was 49 years old and specialized in economic crimes. He'd built his reputation on complex fraud cases, and he understood exactly what kind of monster we were dealing with. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. 12 victims testified about Daniel's pattern of targeting vulnerable women. The audio recordings played in court showed Daniel's cold calculation and explicit threats. Bank records proved the payments to false witnesses. Hospital logs and security footage documented his attempts to defraud Emily while she was dying. Daniel's new defense attorney tried to argue that his client was suffering from gambling addiction and temporary mental disorder that impaired his judgment. But the evidence of meticulous planning and systematic fraud made that defense laughable. Judge Evelyn Hart was 61 years old and had presided over criminal cases for over 20 years. She'd seen every kind of fraud and every type of criminal, but I could tell that Daniel Peterson's case had affected her personally. On November 15, 2025, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Hart sentenced Daniel to 25 years in prison, 18 years for continuous fraud and extortion, 3 years for forgery, 2 years for coercion and threats against a vulnerable adult, and 2 years for witness tampering. She also ordered restitution of $847,000 to all known victims and imposed a lifetime ban on any form of financial consulting or investment advice. Daniel Peterson was 42 years old when he was sentenced. He would be 67 years old when he was released, with no professional license, no reputation, and no prospects for rebuilding the life he destroyed through his own greed and cruelty. His appeals to the Illinois Supreme Court were denied. The evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear, the harm too extensive. Daniel Peterson would serve every day of his 25-year sentence. But winning the legal battle wasn't enough for me. Emily's death had left a hole in the world that could never be filled, but I wanted to make sure her legacy would continue to help other women achieve the dreams that Daniel Peterson and men like him tried to destroy. In January 2026, I used $15 million of Emily's bequest to establish the Emily Miller Foundation for Women Entrepreneurs. Patricia Johnson agreed to serve as executive director, leaving her position at M Avenue to focus full-time on the foundation's mission. The foundation provides interest-free microloans to women starting businesses after experiencing abandonment, divorce, or other life transitions. We offer legal aid to protect women from predators like Daniel Peterson. We provide mentoring programs that connect successful businesswomen with entrepreneurs who are just starting their journeys. But the foundation's most important work is the part that connects directly to Emily's story. We maintain a database of men like Daniel Peterson, predators who target vulnerable women for financial exploitation. We share information with law enforcement, victim advocacy groups, and financial institutions to help identify and stop these criminals before they can cause more harm. Emily's 1967 Mustang holds a place of honor in the foundation's lobby. I had it restored to exactly the condition it was in when Margaret was alive, painted that same deep blue that Emily loved so much. There's a plaque next to it that tells Emily's story and her mother's story, and explains how two women's love for a car became a symbol of strength, independence, and the refusal to let anyone else control your destiny. Every year, we give our top grant recipient a ride in Emily's Mustang. We call it the Mustang Scholar program, and it's become one of our most popular traditions. There's something powerful about sitting in that car, feeling connected to Emily and Margaret, understanding that their legacy lives on in every woman who refuses to let a man's weakness limit her own strength. The foundation has helped over 500 women start businesses in its first year. We've provided legal aid to dozens of women dealing with financial predators. We've connected hundreds of women with mentors who understand what it means to build something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal and abandonment. That's Emily's real legacy. Not the $35 million she left me, not the vintage Mustang, not even the successful business she built. Her real legacy is the courage she showed in rebuilding her life after Daniel Peterson tried to destroy it, and the inspiration she provides to other women facing the same kind of devastation. Daniel Peterson thought he could come back after 10 years and claim credit for Emily's success. He thought he could intimidate a grieving father and steal money he'd never earned. He thought he could manipulate the legal system and public opinion to get his hands on wealth he had no right to touch. He was wrong about all of it. I said at the beginning that he messed with the wrong dad, but the truth is bigger than that. Daniel Peterson messed with the wrong family, the wrong legacy, the wrong memory. He thought Emily's death would make her vulnerable to his predations, but he didn't understand that death had only made her more powerful. Every woman who gets a loan from the Emily Miller Foundation is proof that Emily's vision outlived Daniel's greed. Every successful business started with our help is evidence that love and determination are stronger than abandonment and betrayal. Every predator we help identify and stop is a victory for Emily's memory and a defeat for the men who think they can profit from women's pain. Daniel Peterson wanted to be remembered as the man who helped build M Avenue. Instead, he'll be remembered as the criminal who tried to steal from a dying woman and ended up in prison for 25 years. He wanted to claim Emily's legacy, but instead he helped create an even bigger legacy that will protect women for generations to come. The rage I felt at Emily's funeral has been transformed into something more powerful and more lasting. It's been channeled into justice, into protection, into a foundation that will outlive all of us and continue fighting the battles that Emily fought every day of her adult life. Daniel Peterson thought he could break Emily's legacy by stealing her money. What he actually did was prove that her legacy was unbreakable, and that sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to make sure their enemies pay for every single thing they did wrong. He messed with the wrong dad, but more importantly, he couldn't break the right legacy. If Emily's story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. If you or someone you know needs a second chance to start a business after abandonment, visit the Emily Miller Foundation link in the description. Emily would want her story to help other women build the lives they deserve, free from men who think they have the right to control or claim what women create with their own hands and their own vision. That's how we win. That's how Emily wins. That's how we make sure that Daniel Peterson and men like him learn that there are consequences for targeting the people we love. Every day that foundation operates, every woman who gets help, every business that succeeds, that's our victory. That's Emily's victory. And that's the legacy that will last long after Daniel Peterson is forgotten in whatever hole he ends up in when he gets out of prison as a broken old man with nothing left. He thought he could steal Emily's money, but what he actually did was help create something bigger and more powerful than any amount of money could ever be. He tried to profit from her death, and instead he helped birth a movement that will protect women for decades to come. That's justice. That's revenge. That's love in action. And that's how you deal with a predator who thinks he can come back from the dead to claim what was never his in the first place.